Limited, Mr. Don Webby, members of the boards of directors of the GraceKennedy Foundation and GraceKennedy Limited, and I must offer apologies from Mr. Douglas O'Rain and Mrs. Hilary Webby, who are not able to be here with us. This evening's lecturer, Professor Micheal A. Taylor and his family, members of the Diplomatic Corps, former lecturers, and I want to make a special mention of the first Executive Director of the Foundation, Mrs. Marjorie Humphreys, who is here with us this evening. We're very happy to have her. Members of the media, distinguished guests, colleagues, students, friends. There are several individuals and groups who have become loyal supporters of the lecture series, who are here again this evening, and we are grateful for your dedication and the insight many of you bring to the discussion period. Significant members of this group are our secondary and tertiary students, their teachers and lecturers. Many of you have traveled miles to be in Kingston this afternoon, and we are honored by the effort you have made to be here with us. We are also excited that we have been able to expand our reach by streaming the lecture live on YouTube, and we especially welcome those of you participating via the internet. We welcome members of the media. Over the years, they have ensured that the discussion and debate on our topics continue in the press and electronic media. We thank you and urge you to make a special effort to keep the issue of climate change in the public sphere. Thank you all for joining us this evening. We are confident that you will find the lecture interesting and thought-provoking and look forward to a lively and stimulating discussion period. Professor Elizabeth Thomas Hope, Professor Emerita of the University of the West Indies, and presenter of the 8th GraceKennedy Foundation lecture, is a director of the GraceKennedy Foundation, and she will now introduce this afternoon's lecturer, following which we invite Professor Taylor to deliver the 2015 lecture. Thank you.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, our GraceKennedy Foundation lecturer this evening gave his own reflections on how he would like to be regarded when he told an interviewer, "I would like to be thought of as a lecturer who loves his students, a researcher who is passionate about his research, and one who inspires future generations of UWI faculty to do the same." This tells us a great deal about Professor Micheal Taylor, for we can confidently say that his academic career to date has brought distinction to his faculty, his university, and his country. His work has been celebrated and recognized through the many awards that he has received, nationally and internationally. He was the recipient in 1999 of the American Meteorological Society Global Change Scholar Award, in 2004 of the START International Young Scientist Award, and in 2008 of the Caribbean Academy of Science Young Scientist Award. In 2005, he received the Jamaican Scientific Research Council Young Scientist Award, and in 2013, the Institute of Jamaica's Silver Musgrave Medal for Outstanding Merit in the Field of Science. He has also won awards from the UWI Faculty of Pure and Applied Sciences for teaching and for best publication on 4 occasions, and the award for most outstanding research activity in that faculty twice. His academic specialization lies in the area of atmospheric physics. Having gained a first-class honors bachelor's degree in physics from the University of the West Indies, he pursued graduate work at the University of Maryland in the USA, and this work was funded by a University of Maryland postgraduate fellowship and later a National Aeronautical and Space Administration, in other words, NASA fellowship, resulting in master's and doctoral degrees. Micheal Taylor joined the Department of Physics at the UWI as a lecturer in 1999, and in 2009 was appointed head of the department, and in 2013 was appointed professor. Since 2007, Professor Taylor has been the director of the Climate Change Studies Group, MONA, CSGM, a multi-country collaborative initiative which comprises a team of researchers who study climate variability and its impact on short-term changes in the Caribbean climate. Based on its analysis of data, the CSGM provides governments and private sector interests in the Caribbean with predictive models of regional climate trends for several decades to come, and so can facilitate informed planning. Professor Taylor's research has contributed to theories on Caribbean climate variability, and his work is widely disseminated and frequently cited. He sits on several regional scientific steering committees and is one of a panel of 12 international experts who oversee the science program for the World Climate Research Programme's variability of the American monsoon system. Professor Taylor understands that real change is effected only when the wider community is fully engaged. Consequently, he has been actively involved in leading environmental care projects in his local Baptist church, of which he is a deacon. These projects include recycling, rehabilitating green spaces, and recently he has been part of a group encouraging participation in Jamaican adaptation of a Lenten carbon fast, a practical way of focusing the discipline of thinking and acting with personal responsibility for the environment. When his head is not in the clouds or any other part of the atmosphere, I understand he plays Pan, and among other artistic pursuits, that along with his brothers has even written a national pantomime. With all of that, you will understand that he must have a very supportive family: parents, wife, Yvette, and children, Amanda, Melanie, and William, who are all here this evening. Perhaps his family would kindly stand for us to acknowledge them in the usual manner. And so now, please help me welcome to the podium Professor Micheal Taylor.
Professor Leorini, Professor Thomas Hope, other distinguished members of the GraceKennedy family, the diplomatic corps, other members of the audience, family, friends, colleagues, good afternoon. Let me begin by saying what an honor it is really to be here this afternoon delivering this lecture. I want to sincerely thank the GraceKennedy Foundation for asking me to do so, and then for providing me with tremendous support throughout the process. I think it is at this point now that I can confess it has been a daunting task. And really, who wouldn't be daunted to be standing on the backs of the kinds of names of persons who have previously delivered this lecture, including my own father? Because 22 years ago, I sat in a room listening to my father deliver the GraceKennedy Foundation lecture. And so you... But so you can imagine that this is a double portion of intimidation. Nonetheless, I am really grateful. And grateful for, in a way, I view my standing here today as a means of paying tribute to the many who have inspired us all as a country through their manner of thinking and their being, and through their contributions to Jamaican society, including through this lecture series. And that also includes my own father. And so I thank GraceKennedy Foundation really seriously for the opportunity they have provided for me to offer this tribute in this way today. As you have heard, my children are also here today, Amanda, Melanie, and William. And so I want to say something to them. No pressure. It is not a family tradition that we are starting here. And so I have no expectations about what 22 years from now will bring. But let me also quickly pay tribute to my wife as well and the other family members, especially those who have supported me during this whole process. And thank also the Climate Studies Group Mona of the University of the West Indies, and in particular Miss Felicia White, who is sitting somewhere in the back there, for assistance received in preparing this lecture. But I'm not going to keep us going for long, so let's get to the matter at hand. Why does climate demand change? This afternoon, really all that I want to do is offer you what I am going to call, let's just get this. What I'm going to do is offer you what I'm going to call a physicist's contextual reading of the state of the climate with respect to, state of the Caribbean with respect to climate. So it's a contextual reading because all I'm really going to do is offer you 3 observations, or just some observations, about the state of the Caribbean with respect to climate. But it's a physicist's contextual reading because all good physicists love a good equation. And so I'm going to offer you an equation. And I'm going to be bold enough to name it the Taylor's equation of state of the Caribbean with respect to climate. Well, my equation is going to be very simple. It's going to look like this. A plus B plus C equals D. And that's all I want to do, offer you this equation. D is going to be my reading from observations about what the desired state of the Caribbean should be with respect to climate. And then A, B, and C are going to be my reading of what the current state of the Caribbean is with respect to climate. So all I want to do in this lecture is offer you what A, B, C, and D are. D being the desired state, A, B, C being the current state. And in fact, I want to get along with it very quickly by telling you immediately and off the bat what D is. And I get D from a very landmark statement that came out of the SIDS conference, the Small Island Developing States Conference that was held in Samoa recently, well, in November of last year. And they suggested climate change represents the gravest threat to survival and viability of small island states. Well, if it is true that climate change represents the gravest threat to survival and viability, and in my mind, survival plus viability equals sustainability, then you can see that variable D in my equation is sustainability. And so all I want to do then is offer you 3 observations about what variable A and B and C must be. And then leave it up to you to decide whether A plus B plus C equals sustainability. All right, but before I can offer you A, B, and C, I think I need to set a little bit of a background. Forgive me, I'm a scientist, so we're going to talk a little science. So here is a background. I need to set up, of course, first of all, what do we mean when we talk about climate? When we talk about climate, we have to make a little bit of a distinction. We make a distinction between climate variability and climate change. By variability, we talk about the short-term changes in climate. So we talk about changes that could happen this year, but not be the same next year. Or we talk about changes in groups of years, or even changes on decadal scales. So if I were to plot what the mean temperature of the Earth were to look like over the last 150 years, you don't have to worry what it looks like, but you can see that the variability in it. The variability in that plot would be represented by the squiggles in the plot, squiggles being a great scientific term. The climate change, however, is looking on the long-term changes in the climate. And in that plot, climate change now would be represented by the long-term trend that we have seen over the last 100 years. So the straight line. So we make this distinction between variability, short-term changes, and change, which is a long-term change. What causes climate to change? Well, a number of things. When we think about variability or the short-term change, climate change is associated with what we call some global phenomenon, and they usually have some known cycle to it. So many of us have heard about the El Niño phenomenon. And an El Niño is nothing more than a warming of the equatorial Pacific. So if you look in the plot, you can see that big red blob over the ocean in the Pacific, and an El Niño is a warming. And that warming normally occurs every 3 to 7 years. The thing about it is that when it warms, it normally dries out the Caribbean. And so if you look on the plot right beside it, you will notice that every couple years we go into drought. So the variability is driven by the natural cycle of the El Niño. Every so many years we get dry due to the El Niño. Climate change, on the other hand, has a number of things that can cause it to change. Climate can be changed due to natural variations. Climate can change due to volcanic eruptions. And the one that we want to deal with here today is a climate that is changing due to human activity. Now, human activity like burning of fossil fuels, so when we burn oil or gas or coal for electricity or for industry or for transportation, it contributes to climate change. Or when we cut down trees for deforestation is a contribution to climate change. What happens is that human activity allows for the releasing of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And carbon dioxide now enhances what is known as the greenhouse effect. And the greenhouse effect is nothing more than literally the atmosphere acting like a greenhouse. So it allows the sun's rays in, they heat up the earth, and then the atmosphere traps that heat. And part of the thing that causes the atmosphere to trap the heat is, of course, carbon dioxide. So human activity releases carbon dioxide. It contributes to the greenhouse effect. And the result is that as the carbon dioxide increases, which is the blue line, you can see that the temperatures, which is the red line, also increase. And so climate change is directly related to human beings' release of carbon dioxide. Well, therefore, one of the manifestations of climate change is clearly warmer temperatures, and the warming is everywhere, as you can see in the diagram for the world. But it's not only warmer temperatures, for when the temperatures warm, then the rainfall becomes variable. And so everywhere that it's green, the rainfall is getting wetter, and everywhere that is brown, it is getting drier. And not only does the rain become variable, but we get stronger extremes. And so if we look on hurricane intensity, you can see the upward slope of climate change in the hurricane intensity. And then if you look on sea ice, you can see that it is declining. And then, of course, if you look on sea level rise, you can see the upward trend of climate change in it. So when you put all of this together, these are the manifestations of climate change. What then is the context that I am reading for the Caribbean? I'm reading this context. We live in a context of variability and climate change, where climate change is a distinct changes in measures of climate, things like rainfall, temperature, wind speed, but those lasting for long periods of time due to human action. In the Caribbean, our challenge is to live with the variability while contending with the change. So it's this context then that I want to offer you my reading and my 3 observations. I want to offer 3 observations about the state of the Caribbean with respect to climate. And as I told you, my observations will come in the form of A plus B plus C equal sustainability. Let's go on. Observation number 1. What then is observation number 1? It's this. The Caribbean possesses an inherent sensitivity to climate. What does that mean? In my equation of state, variable A is sensitivity. it turns out that, boy, Caribbean countries, their economies, the daily ordering of the life of their people and their natural systems are extremely sensitive to variations in climate on whatever time scales they occur. How do we come by this? A couple of reasons. One, our geographic location. When we look on our geographic location, we are strategically located in the Atlantic, but with close proximity to the Pacific. What does this do? This sets up a very familiar pattern or seasonality in our rainfall and temperature. So if you look on the diagram and the bars represent the rainfall, you see the pattern that you and I are used to. So you can see that January, February, March, we are dry. And so we expect the drying that we have now. But by the time we hit May, you can see that the rainfall pattern has gone up, and we stay wet from May to November with a brief drying in the middle in July. And that characteristic bimodal pattern, or that characteristic M-shaped pattern, becomes a pattern around which we build life. And if you look at the little line at the top, that's the temperatures. And we don't vary much in temperatures, but you can see that by the time we hit the middle of the year, we are slightly warmer. What happens with this? We can see this pattern in various indicators of life in the Caribbean region. And so, if we look, for example, on how much water we can get from our rivers, for example, how much water can we get from the Great River? Can you see the M-shaped pattern of the rainfall in the stream flow of the rivers? And if, for example, you look on how many reports of fire were made at the Clarendon Fire Station, and we flip it upside down, can you see the M-shaped pattern of the rainfall in the fire reports? And then if, for example, you look at energy consumption, generation and sales, it's not the rainfall M-shaped pattern that you see now, but you see the pattern of the temperatures where it peaks in the middle of July. And we build our life around this pattern. So you can see it then also in the agriculture pattern, because we reap and plant around this pattern. We even offer recreation around this pattern. We build our life around this pattern. So climate then becomes entrenched in the general ordering of Caribbean life, so much so to the extent that there's a dependence on the regularity and familiarity of this annual cycle to provide us with a sense of what is normal. So this pattern contributes to our sensitivity. But it's not the only thing that contributes to our sensitivity. Turns out our geographic characteristics also. In the Caribbean region, we're either all low-lying or volcanic with mountainous interiors and very short coastlines, or we possess some combination of hilly interiors and limited coastal plains, and you see it spelled out for Jamaica right there. What does this mean? This means that the combination of size and topography severely restricts the available land for the development and forces the dependent on either narrow coastal areas or very, very steep hillsides for the location of major cities, infrastructure, large-scale agricultural plots, and economic and industrial zones. It should not surprise you that in that previous plot, 10 of our 13 capitals are located on the coast. 50% of the Caribbean lives within 1.5 kilometers of the coast, which means that they are automatically sensitive to climate variations. And if you are not among the 50% in the coast, the other 50% therefore lives on the hills. But then when the rain comes too heavily, you also are susceptible. So our geographic characteristics make us sensitive. It's not just our geographic location and our geographic characteristics, but our economic activities. We rely on economic activities which in their present form are very dependent on favorable climatic conditions and natural resources. So we only need to think about agriculture and tourism and the fact that combined they contribute to about 14 or 15% of the GDP for Jamaica in 2012 and 2013, or approximately nearly 50% of the labor force in the Caribbean. Both things together help account for the strong link between livelihoods and climate in the Caribbean. And then if you don't want to take the fact that geographic location makes us sensitive, or geographic characteristics makes us sensitive, or economic activities, then you only need to think about water. For in the Caribbean, rainfall is thing. It turns out that we have this overwhelming dependence on surface and groundwater, which means we have a very strong dependence on rainfall. And so when you put all of these things together, you can see that we have a sensitivity. Our context is one of being sensitive to climate. And a very interesting sensitivity, if I might also add, because the sensitivity is an embedded sensitivity or an entrenched sensitivity. Because it turns out that even if we could diversify economic activities to get rid of that sensitivity, we can't change geographic location or geographic characteristics. So the sensitivity is embedded in us. It's not only embedded, but it's also pervasive through either direct or indirect influence. So because all of life has this pattern built around it, then it means that all parts of life has a sensitivity built into it. Whether it's health or agriculture or forestry, water resources, it matters not. The sensitivity is pervasive. And if the sensitivity is embedded and it is pervasive, it is also significant. And really what I'm getting at by talking about significant is that it's disproportionate. So there are other countries in the world that are also sensitive to climate, but they share one or two of those characteristics. It's a Caribbean that shares all four. Our context is very simply one of sensitivity. You can see then why in Taylor's equation of state, variable A is sensitivity. And you know, before I leave it, that sensitivity tells us something about what climate is demanding. Because if we are so inherently sensitive to just the patterns of climate, then climate is demanding, first of all, attention. And that is attention even if the climate were not changing. We have an inherent sensitivity. Climate demands attention. Okay, but very quickly, let me move on. What would be my second observation? My second observation, then, would be this. Climate change is transforming our sensitivity into a vulnerability. What does that mean? You can guess it. It means that variable B in Taylor's equation of state is vulnerability. The context that we have is not just a context of sensitivity, but it's also a context of vulnerability. Vulnerability can be defined as a function of sensitivity, exposure, and capacity to cope. Well, I've just argued that we certainly meet the first criteria of sensitivity. And so it is true, the Caribbean has always been sensitive to changes in climate, simply because we are just inherently climate sensitive. So when the climate varies, we expect that all of life must also vary as well. We just have this sensitivity, and so we are vulnerable. And if the sensitivity is pervasive, then you can see that the vulnerability also has to be pervasive. Okay. What is climate change doing? Climate change is now moving us to new levels of exposure and challenging our capacity to cope. So in effect, what climate change is doing is moving us beyond our normal expectations of vulnerability to the occasional hurricane or heavy rain. And in fact, taking that part of who we are as determined by our sensitivity to climate and gradually making it into a liability, because it's affecting our exposure and our capacity to cope. How do I come by this? Well, this is partly where the science helps us, because the first thing that the science really tells us is that climate is changing. And so, if we look at our temperatures in the Caribbean region, and I use the groundbreaking work of Dr. Tanisha Stevenson, who is in the audience, then you will notice that, boy, if I look on the top diagram, which looks on warm days, everywhere you see a red triangle that is upward means that the thing is increasing. What can you tell me about the warm days? It is clearly increasing. So if we look on the past 50 years, the number of warm days we have in the Caribbean have been increasing. And if you look to the diagram on the right, you can see that the trend is just upwards. And if you look on warm nights, you also see the same pattern, because the triangles are all upturned and red as well. And you can see that the trend is also upward. But you should also note that the upward trend is far more significant than for the warm days. It is true, it is hotter at nights than at days. And then if you look on the cool nights, you can see that the number of cool nights we've been having in the region have been going down. So our temperatures, the science tells us, has been increasing. Our climate is changing. But it's not just the temperatures that have been changing, but it turns out that our rainfall is becoming more variable. And so the plot of rainfall I showed you before, you can see that the characteristic of the rain is that one year it is high, but then the next year it is down. And then the next year it goes back up, and we have a pattern of extreme variability. And the variability we have been seeing in relation to climate has been increasing in the recent times. And it's not just that the variability is increasing, but the character of rain is also changing. Tell me if you do not notice these things. We have a long pattern of dry, and then when it rains, it doesn't just rain, it rains. And so the character of rain is also changing. And that is how climate change is manifesting itself in the region. But it's not only that temperatures are increasing and rain is becoming more variable, but we're getting more storms and hurricanes. So if you look on the right plot, it shows you, if I take a 200-kilometer radius around Jamaica and look on just the last 12 years of between 2000 and 2012 rather, we have had 12 hurricanes or storms passing within 200 kilometers of us. But compare it to the 20 years before that, and there were only 4. Our number of hurricanes and storms have been increasing. Not all due to climate change, but climate change is playing a significant role. And then lastly, our sea levels are also rising. And so if we look throughout the Caribbean region, we see numbers for Jamaica very similar to numbers for the rest of the region and for the world. We have been increasing in our sea levels have been increasing by about 1.6 somewhere millimeters per year. But when you put all of that together, so you take the warmer temperatures and the more variable rainfall and the more storms and hurricanes and the higher sea levels, what emerges is a new climate regime. We are having to contend with the emergence of a new climate regime. And that new climate regime is marked by a couple of things. First of all, unfamiliarity. So the new highs that we're reaching and the new lows that we are going to are just simply unfamiliar to us. And so it is for that reason that the Met Service would write, the drought of 2009-10 was the worst drought in 25 years. And as a result, there wasn't enough rainfall to keep the water distribution in the NWC's facilities to any parishes, especially for the highly populated Kingston and St. Andrew. I wasn't talking last year. This is 2009, 2010. But it's an unfamiliar pattern. And if it's unfamiliar, then it is also unpredictable. So we're going into a new climate regime marked by unpredictability. Yes, it is true we have made significant strides in terms of predicting climate, but the regime we are in is also beating our strides at predictability. And so for that reason, the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology can write, the greatest challenge associated with that 09-10 drought was the region's inability to recognize the onset of the drought and the severity. The new regime is unpredictable. And if it is unfamiliar and it's unpredictable, it is also unreliable. Remember that seasonal pattern on which our reassurances had come to rely. It turns out that it is failing us. And so we can no longer expect that the rain at the end of the year is going to come to replenish the water supply so that the following year we can get through the dry period. It's unreliable. The pattern is becoming unreliable. And so it is for that reason that, one study can write that Caribbean farmers are lamenting the lack of reference points in the climate or even associated biodiversity on which to base judgments for planting and reaping. We are in an unreliable regime. When I first started at the University of the West Indies, you could apparently rely on the blossoming of the pui trees to study. If that's what you are relying on now, then you have already failed. We are entering then into a new climate regime. Our climate is changing. And that climate regime is marked by unfamiliarity, unpredictability, and unreliability. So what happens in this new climate regime of unfamiliarity, unpredictability, and unreliability? Well, it turns out that our levels of exposure are changing, and in that way impacting the vulnerability. What on earth do I mean? Well, it turns out that though we are all inherently sensitive, there are some parts of us that had less exposure simply because they had secondary linkages to climate. And so they would, whereas there are some sectors that would immediately feel the link of a change, there are some sectors that would feel it later because of their secondary linkages. In this new climate regime, the vulnerabilities of sectors that were previously veiled because of their secondary linkages are emerging and emerging at a faster pace. Let me illustrate it with the headlines of the newspapers from last year's drought. You would expect some of these headlines, the ones you'd expect immediately, are headlines related to agriculture, food shortages. You'd expect the headlines related to water, and certainly you would expect the headlines related to forest fires. But very quickly after those headlines came headlines saying that education was being affected by school closures. And very quickly after education was energy was being affected because hydroelectricity and power outages import more due to dry conditions and salt on the sea lines. And then very quickly it moved to that the whole economy was being impacted. And that is, of course, due to impact on small businesses and economic productivity. Can you see that climate change is transforming those inherent sensitivities which were previously masked into real vulnerabilities because the ripple is going much further and much quicker? But it's not only that it's expanding the level of exposures by bringing out those secondary linkages, but it's challenging the levels of exposures in a second way. It turns out that as the climate is changing, new vulnerable groupings are also emerging, and that is because of this expanded exposure. What do I mean? Well, I only need to show you Caribbean terrace. Simply to say that what was once thought as distant and unreachable by climate change, the level of exposure has expanded, and so the distant infrastructure now becomes part of the new vulnerable. And it's the same thing we can think about for infrastructure, we can think about for other groupings. And so our environment, flora and fauna are among the new emerging or the emerging vulnerable groups because the changes in temperature are pushing the envelope within which they can survive. And other vulnerable groupings are people like outdoor workers who are facing harsher conditions, or asthma sufferers, or the chronically ill, or the elderly, the young, the physically challenged, and small business owners who are the first people usually to feel the impact when the labor force pulls out because they are sick due to a new emergent disease, not talking chickpea necessarily, or when the labor force is impacted by an extreme. Can you see that climate change is altering the vulnerability that we used to know by altering the levels of exposure? And let me push it one more point, one more step. In the new climate change, it's not only changing the levels of exposure, but it's challenging our capacity to cope. In this case, it's not the intensity of the climate change. It's not that we're getting more severe thing, but it is the recurrent nature of the extreme. So if I put up this table from the Planning Institute of Jamaica, you immediately see what I'm saying. In 2001, we got hit by Micheal, and it was 8.8% of our GDP. And then in 2002, we had flood range, which contributed 0.7% of our GDP. Then Charlie in 4, and if we thought we got our quota for 4, then Ivan came with 8% of our GDP impact. Then Dennis and Emily in 5, Wilma in 5, Dean in 7, Gustav in 8, Nicole in 10, and Hurricane Sandy in 12. Can you see the challenge climate change is putting up to our capacity to cope? It is really not hard to conjecture that the impact of recurring climate extremes in the recent past easily surpasses any of the economic contingencies that would have been put in place to accommodate the normal variations of climate. As our capacity to cope nears exceedance levels, our vulnerability is being transformed. What am I trying to say then? I'm trying to say that the second thing that describes the state of the Caribbean with respect to climate is vulnerability. The first in my reading is sensitivity, the second is vulnerability. And it tells us what the climate is demanding. Because if sensitivity is demand saying, pay attention to climate, then vulnerability is saying, give consideration to climate. When you are planning, at least put climate as a bullet point, even if it's the last bullet point. But vulnerability then becomes variable B in Taylor's equation of state. What then is variable C? Let me give you a third observation. My third observation is that in my contextual reading of the Caribbean's current state, this is what I see. There is clear recognition of need for action, but evidence of action is frustratingly absent or limited. What then becomes variable C? Variable C is inertia. Let me try to put it together. So, why do I say this at all? A little more science. I promise the last bit of this is the science of what we do at the University of the West Indies in the Climate Studies group. We do the science of modeling. And what is the science of modeling? The science of modeling tells us, well, if we can take storylines about how the climate is going to change as we go to the end of the century, the world is going to change as we go to the end of the century. So we take storylines, the world may become more developed technologically, or the population may increase and then decrease, or we may become more globalized. But we take all of these storylines and we can calculate what the CO2 emissions are going to be related to these storylines. Then it means that on the left, we can come up with different scenarios of emission. So if you look on the left, you can see that one scenario just starts and continues rising to the end of the century. The CO2 never stops increasing. That's the worst case storyline. And then if you look in the middle, on the same panel on the left, you can see one of the lines goes up, but not as high as to the other. And then if you look, same panel on the left, at the bottom line, it goes up to the middle of the century and then comes down. That for us is the best case scenario. Interestingly, of all the scenarios, the CO2 continues increasing to the middle of the century. We never have a scenario of the CO2 going down. Well, if I can take all of those scenarios and I can plug those scenarios into a model, and the model is just a computer-based model where all the physics of the climate is, then when I put scenarios or storylines plus model, I can set my model running and come up with a best case and a worst case of what the climate will be at the end of the century. Let me tell you what the models are showing for the Caribbean region. It's a pretty daunting picture. Firstly, our temperatures will continue to rise. So what are you looking on? The top two panels are the best case and the worst case, and the bottom two panels are the better case. In the panels, if I can coin the phrase, the oranger it is the hotter it becomes. Can you spot Jamaica in it? It doesn't matter which scenario you take, the Caribbean is going to be hotter at the end of the century. And by how much will we be hotter? We'll be hotter by 1 to 3.5 degrees hotter. And the same pattern of warming is going to happen. So the daytime temperatures are going to warm and the nighttime temperatures are going to get even hotter. Now, if we're troubled already, can you imagine as we go to the end of the century? And the kind of warming we see is going to historically exceed any kind of warming we have had already. But the models also say it's not only that we are going to get hotter, but here is the rainfall. And everywhere that it's brown, it's dry at the end of the century. And if you can spot Jamaica amidst the brown, it's brown no matter what scenario you take. And so the general tendency is that we're going to be drier in the main Caribbean basin by the end of the century, anywhere between 25 and 30% drier in the mean. What does this suggest? Well, problem with the drying is that we are sure we are going to be driest in June, July, August, September, and October. Remember that pattern of the seasonality pattern. We are driest when we expect to get rain. And it's not only that the models are telling us that our temperatures are going to continue to increase and that we are going to get drier, but the models are also telling us that we're going to have more intense storms. So the top panel is category 4 and 5 hurricanes. No, The bottom panel is category 4 and 5 hurricanes in the future. So not necessarily more hurricanes, but certainly more intense hurricanes. And then if the temperatures will rise and the rainfall is going to get dry and we're going to get more intense storms, we're going to have higher sea levels. And if you can make out the diagram on the left, there are little lines coming in from the coast. And each little line represents how much land is taken with 1 meter, 2 meter, 5 meter, etc. levels of sea level rise. People often can't envision, well, what does 2 meter sea level rise mean? Here's what it means. 1% of Jamaica land area will be lost. The people who live in those 1% will be displaced. 20% of our power plants are going to be lost. 18% of our tourist resorts will be damaged. 60% of our airports, I don't know which 60 that is, will be gone. 2% of our roads that ring the coast are lost. And 100% of our port structure. I don't want to say that with Prof in front of Prof Shirley, but that's just one study. But you get the concept that this is significant. With that kind of picture of rising temperatures, rainfall that is drying out, more intense storms, and higher sea levels, can you see that the impacts are going to be significant? And if the sensitivity was pervasive, and if the vulnerability was pervasive, then the impacts are also going to be pervasive. So we'll have health impacts, dengue. We will have agricultural impacts, food security threatened. We'll have forestry impacts and water resources impacts and coastal areas and wildlife, and you name any area of life. If the sensitivity and the vulnerability is pervasive, then the impacts are also going to be pervasive. Let's just push this. If then we do not have action, so in the face of inaction, there are a couple of things we want to bear in mind. Firstly, in the face of inaction, the impacts to climate change are then only going to grow. And they're going to grow at differential rates. What do I mean? Well, the impacts of sea level rise, the drying that I'm telling you is going to go on to the end of the century. And even something like ocean acidification have a characteristic that they are creeping. So they are really slow impacts over time. So much so that you could almost miss them. But then the impacts of something like an intense hurricane, you can't miss. But you get this growing impact, and the growth will be at different rates. What does this mean? This is a call, therefore, for action, and action which is supported by monitoring. We have to begin monitoring now so that we do not miss the impacts, especially those that have that creeping characteristic. But the first thing that we can tell from all the impact studies is that the impacts of climate change will only grow, though at differential rates. A very similar thing is that when the impacts are going to grow, some thresholds beyond which effective response are possible are going to be attained and exceeded. So we're going to go over some thresholds. What does that mean? One very recent threshold that was in the news quite a lot was the temperature threshold. So if you look on that diagram, the left-hand side is how our present temperatures are changing. And the right-hand side are the various scenarios of how the temperatures are going to change going into the future. Moore et al., who did the study, came up with a term that they call departure, and they said, if I take the warmest year that I have seen to date, and I draw a line from the warmest year I have seen to date going through to the end of the century, and I find the first year when the coolest temperatures we will experience thereafter are warmer than the warmest temperatures we have received to date, that's my climate departure date. It turns out that for Jamaica, that date sits somewhere in the mid-2020s. Climate change is not something distant. In fact, they put a date of 2023 when we will have reached temperature departure. Now, when we have reached temperature departure, lots of things will happen because we'll have moved out of the realm within which biodiversity will be able to live. And it's not hard to think that if we can come up with a temperature departure date, then in the socio-economic realm, we can also come up with departure dates. And some of them we might already have passed. It's a strong possibility that, in fact, the current design standards and siting for critical social infrastructure we may have already passed that departure date. So we get the concept. The impacts are going to grow, and as they grow, some critical thresholds beyond which response is effective might be passed. Let me say one more thing quickly. The impacts not only are going to grow and some thresholds are going to be passed, but the impacts are going to be unequally distributed and disproportionately affect some more than others. If I was thinking sectors, I could immediately say that the water and the agriculture sector are probably going to be disproportionately impacted under climate change. But we can extend it, because some existing inequities will likely only increase, especially if resources remain scarce to deal with them. So we're going to have disproportionate impacts, and probably those who will feel it most are the urban poor, the subsistence farmers, the physically challenged, the children, the elderly, the small businesses, and of course the natural environment. And then one last thing about these impacts in the case of inaction. They are going to be costly. I'll just tell you the results of one study that estimates that if we just consider hurricane damage, tourism losses, and infrastructure change due to sea level rise, the Caribbean's annual cost of inaction will be US $22 billion annually by 2050, or $46 billion by 2100, or 10% and 22% respectively of the Caribbean economy in 2004. What about for Jamaica? The cost as a percentage of 2004 GDP will be 13.9% in 2025, 28% in 2050, 42% in 2075, and 57% by the end of the century, if we do not act. The costs are going to be costly. What is all of this saying? There's clearly a case being made by climate for urgent, informed, targeted action. Before I leave this third point, let me just say, is it that there has not been any action? In fact, I am arguing that there is evidence of recognition for the need for action. So if I go on the regional scale, I look to the fact that in 2005, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center was formed, or the 5 Cs. And the 5 Cs is a CARICOM-mandated entity to put climate change on the map of CARICOM countries. And the 5 Cs have come up with what they call a regional framework for countries to deal with climate. And then they have gone further and come up with an implementation plan for the regional framework. And if I come local, we have both a ministry and a division that has climate change in its name. And the recent CAP study tells us that 80% of the people in Jamaica know the term climate change. So there is not a lack of recognition about climate change. Yet, in my reading, the following are also true. Climate change is seen as important, but not a priority. Climate change is seen as an add-on when we have dealt with everything else, but not integrated from the outset. And climate change is largely responded to when it is convenient to do so, or when the project funds are available, but not something to go out of your way for. Put all of that together, can you see that our state is inertia? Let me put the inertia one last step. If you want to see evidence of inertia, just look on our attitudes to climate change. I'm going to argue that our attitudes to climate change are the following. One, we either have complacency about climate change. So we recognize that the climate is changing, and then we simply just make plans to accommodate for the change. So it is getting hotter, we buy a fan and burn it all through the night. But the problem with accommodation is, of course, that it usually leads you to choosing the easiest or the most convenient option, but not necessarily the best option. And if we're not suffering from complacency, then we're suffering from amnesia. So when we are in the midst of the discomfort brought on by the climate extreme, we make plans so that if we ever fall into this trap again, you bet that we will be prepared. But once normality comes back after the extreme has passed, we gradually forget about the inconvenience until the next time the extreme comes around. And if we're not suffering from complacency or amnesia, we're suffering from minimization. What do I mean? So we recognize the threat, but we say, boy, 1 millimeter per year rise of sea level is just really too small to bother about. Or 1 degree rise in temperature is really just too small. And so I don't have to worry about it now, maybe later when it gets bigger. So we minimize the threat. And if it's not complacency, amnesia, or minimization, then it's resignation. So we throw our hands up in the air and say, boy, there's nothing I can do anyway, it's going to happen. And if it is not resignation, then we pander to uncertainty. So we claim, boy, we just don't know enough yet to really begin acting. So better just keep doing what we are doing now. In the meantime, all the signs of inertia. Why? Because all of them recognize that there is a need for action. All of them recognize that the climate is changing. But the action that they engender always falls short. Because complacency makes you not proactive, and so the action does not have the proactive element. And amnesia means that if you're always responding to the current threat, then you haven't prepared for the future threat and how climate is going to change, and the action is not adequate. And minimization means that the action is not urgent because it is too small to deal anything now. And then certainly resignation and uncertainty means that you don't even bother to act at all. And so all of them, though there is recognition, the action then becomes limited or absent. So what is climate demanding then based on my third observation? If based on my first observation of sensitivity, climate was demanding attention, and based on my second observation of vulnerability, climate was demanding consideration, then certainly, based on everything I've shown you, climate is demanding action. And it is for that reason then that you can see variable C in my equation must be inertia. But when I fill it in, it now becomes apparent why climate demands change. Because if that is the equation of our current state, then sensitivity plus vulnerability plus inertia does not equal sustainability. Climate demands change because otherwise the pieces don't fit together, or otherwise said, things just don't add up. Well, if this is our current state, sensitivity, vulnerability, and inertia, and it doesn't add up to sustainability, let me just quickly say what it really does is that it threatens sustainability. So it acts in reverse. Because it turns out that climate, everything that I've really been saying, I can sum up by saying climate is impacting the region's geophysical, biological, and socioeconomic systems. I'm summing up by saying climate will continue to impact national budgets, compromise livelihoods, and exacerbate poverty. Without a change in response, climate change will to even greater degrees offset the gains we have already made in terms of priority development objectives. So it will offset the food security we are going after and the access to basic services. And it's going to transform the environment into a hazard. And this is the same environment we premise economic development on. What I'm really saying, if our current state is sensitivity, vulnerability, and inertia, then Jamaica's Vision 2030 to be the place to live, work, raise families, and do business is under threat. In our current state, climate change is grabbing our inertia and threatening our sustainability. So what do we do then? Well, I wouldn't like to leave you on that note, so let me end with this other note. You know what I'm arguing? I'm a physicist and I don't want an equation to my name that is wrong. So I'm arguing that maybe we need Taylor's equation of state version 2.0. And Taylor's equation of state version 2.0 would look like this. Sensitivity plus vulnerability plus resiliency equals sustainability. And this is what I think the equation to characterize our state should look like in the very near future. That would be a good equation. And so really what I'm saying climate is demanding is that we shift somehow or change from inertia to resilience. Okay, So let me end then by suggesting how we're going to move on this pathway to resiliency. This is where it gets a little shaky, because if I knew this, then Jamaica would be. But I think, we are beginning to see that resiliency really demands that a couple of things are being considered. What are they, quickly? One, if we're moving towards resiliency, then we have to give serious consideration to research, data gathering, monitoring, and risk assessment. Because together these actions help to define the risk posed by climate, provide justification for the responsive action, help target the response, inspire confidence in the response that it will be effective even though the climate is unpredictable. This is my unashamed plug for science and research. Resiliency requires that. What else does it require? Some consideration of adaptation. And it requires us to prioritize adaptation. Boy, even if global consensus were to reach to stop greenhouse gases emissions today, the world is already committed to climate change because of how much greenhouse gases we have already put. So we have to adapt to the new and emerging climate regimes, and adaptation has to be prioritized in our resilience strategy. It can't be an option. It has to be a necessary thing, and adaptation has a no-regrets adaptation. So we need things like the agri-parks, which are adaptations, really, to climate change, and fortified and raised roads, diversified tourisms, new building codes, strict zoning for where settlements can be, insurance for climate-sensitive livelihoods, law enforcement, etc. Those are all examples of adaptation strategies, which probably need to be prioritized. And the responsibility for adaptation is not just with government, it's from individual right up through regional. Resiliency has to consider also not just prioritizing adaptation, but also prioritizing mitigation. Now, in the climate change world, mitigation is trying to reduce the thing that caused the problem in the first place, which is the greenhouse gases. And I am saying, listen, the Caribbean must not become preoccupied with arguments about who must reduce and whether it's developed countries must reduce or we must reduce. Instead, we must judiciously support and propose our own models if necessary for differentiated mitigation targets for developed countries and developing countries, because current emission levels are simply unsustainable. We need mitigation that targets preservations of forests, because forests pull carbon dioxide out, waste reduction, because the more efficient you are at a process, is the less amount of carbon dioxide you put out, efficient and alternate generation of energy for electricity, transportation, and industry, because alternate energy does not put out carbon dioxide. And all of these are going to have the spin-off effect of reduced economic costs, increased productivity, and improved quality of life. Mitigation is a win-win for the Caribbean. It is also the strategy that best links individual responsibility to corporate good. I can do something for the benefit of others. Resiliency has to recognize that climate change is not the only game in town. There are limited resources for development, and it is the same resources that must eradicate hunger and poverty, fight crime, provide equitable access to education, provide health services and basic amenities, achieve gender equality, build resilient infrastructure to climate and non-climatic disasters, treat with social injustice, sustain consumption and production patterns, restore and protect terrestrial and aquatic systems, deal with crime, and then after all of that, deal with climate change. But climate change is not the only thing in town, and resiliency has to recognize that. But what we have to do is make sure that adaptation strategies and mitigation strategies, which significantly overlap with the sustainable development goals, we explore the overlap and the synergies between them so that the limited resources are most efficiently used and to maximum impact. Resiliency has to recognize that well-intentioned responses can unfairly disadvantage. So we've already noted that there are some groups that are more vulnerable to others, and the impacts of climate change are disproportionately distributed. In a real sense, climate change singles out the already disadvantaged. So when we crafting mitigation and adaptation responses, we have to take care not to further disadvantage the already disadvantaged. So when we're diverting a river or a stream to create new domestic water sources for an urban region, we put at the disadvantage in these people who live upstream, including the natural world, who depend on the water for livelihood and existence. response should not unfairly put one set of stakeholders at an advantage or disadvantage simply because of the side of the divide on which they fall. Resiliency has to make sure that education is there because education is critical to buy in. I don't think I need to say anything else. Resiliency has to target present variability as a means of responding to future climate change. Go back to where I began. We have to live with the variability even as we contend with the change. And so, when you have limited resources, maybe the best option is not inaction, but just use the resources to target the variability that you now know. You expect that it may fall short, but it will dampen the effect of the future threat. So target the present variability as a means of responding to the future change. Resiliency has to recognize that risk-taking may be a demand of climate change. Achieving resiliency may require risk to be taken with the growing threat of climate, especially when the threat is moving outside the bounds of what is known, and when the response strategies are proving to be no longer sufficient. When a risky response is seen as the only option that you can take, it must be accompanied by the education, especially of all the consequences of its success or failure, careful consideration of the ethics of the action or inaction, continuous monitoring, data gathering, and scientific analysis from the very beginning. Because when risk is put in those kind of consideration, it's not careless risk. And so you can see that those are some of the consideration. So I end with this. Really, the path to resiliency will be through the incorporation of climate change considerations into planning, or mainstreaming of climate change into daily planning. And I simply wanted to say that the act of mainstreaming really is trying to routinize the consideration of climate in daily consideration. What we're asked to do is just begin to incorporate climate in daily planning. And when you begin to mainstream climate, you know what you're doing? You're ensuring that there's always an awareness that climate change is an issue. There's a reasonable understanding of the risk. There's a foreknowledge of the gaps. There's an explicit accounting for climate when you have new big decisions to make, especially those big decisions that affect development, livelihoods, and daily living. You have a proactive approach to dealing with the threats, and you are actively seeking out and grasping at all opportunities to build resilience. So in an environment of scarce resources, how do we mainstream? And this is where I end. Well, when the resources are scarce, I am suggesting that, in fact, what you do is find entry points in existing activities and either insert new actions to fill a gap or strengthen the existing activities so that the net result is greater resilience. So, if I was to offer you some kind of road to resiliency, it would look like this. It would be climate change education for all. So there must be a dedicated effort aimed at finding all entry points to educate about climate change. And we have to take advantage of the already formal systems of education. And then add on to it the professional training courses, the continuing education credits, and the Sunday and the Sabbath schools. Build the climate change education into what education opportunities exist. And then if we need to come up with contextually relevant material that have to be commissioned, then commission it and make it easily accessible. And then you have to target in education the most vulnerable groups. And then I would say, create a climate change registry. Now this could be a division, but a climate change registry. And what I'm saying is that when response is so dependent on external funding as it is now, and so often project-based and being initiated at various levels, then you need coordination of climate change activities. And that becomes critical to leveraging the current situation to maximum benefit. Not that the place has to do everything, they simply need to coordinate. And then we must strengthen community groupings and community governance. Because it turns out that community groups are often the first responders in extreme situations. And outside of disasters, they represent sustained on-the-ground capacity. So when you encourage vibrant community groupings of whatever form and invest in the strengthening of community governance through all levels, up to the local government, then the spin-off effect is facilitating resilience, or at least creating a scenario that can be exploited for resilience building. We have to promote values and attitudes. Why? Well, stewardship equitable and fair use of resources, and the common good are important principles in sustainable development. These principles provide, in the face of climate change, a justification for the individual through to national response. They provide the overarching guidelines when formulating individual through national response. They provide the overarching guidelines for behavior and decision-making in the midst of and in the aftermath of a climatic threat. An ongoing values and attitudes campaign in conjunction with or even spearheaded by the faith-based communities is a resilience building effort. We have to prioritize water. Water is perhaps the issue of climate change for Jamaica and the Caribbean. Because of its direct and cross-cutting nature, any attempts to ensure water security, even independent of climate change, are direct attempts to build resilience. We have to prioritize transportation and roads. Now, under climate change, there is need for quick and easy movement of people and supplies, whether to points of greatest need or away from an imminent threat. Prioritizing the maintenance of coastal roads or even building new interior roads and highways facilitate coast-to-coast access and are important development strategies which have the spin-off of building resilience. Efficient movement is also a mitigation strategy to reduce emissions. Of course, these kinds of actions must take into account all the considerations I said before. We have to prioritize disaster risk management. The potential for climate disasters is only going to increase. A strong and effective disaster preparedness and response mechanism is building climate resilience. We have to always consider the environment, and forgive me for just dwelling a little. The environment and the natural world are currently exploited for economic development, yet they are often the secondary considerations in decisions related to economic development. But a degraded environment exacerbates the impact of climate change threats, and the environment is already among the most vulnerable groupings. The environment is one of a few areas, energy and waste being the other two, that facilitate both adaptation and mitigation responses in a resilience building effort. So even when compromise on the environment is required, it must not be such that it is unfairly placed at a disadvantage. Mainstreaming consideration of the environment and even displaying a little bias towards the environment with respect to protection and preservation will build climate resilience. We have to deal with joined-up government. The pervasive nature of climate change demands that plans and actions developed in one sector have to take into consideration the plans and the impact on another. So when we set targets, we have to set targets consistent across sectors. So the mix of fuels in energy diversification has to be consistent with the mitigation targets, how much we want to reduce the carbon dioxide. Sustainability of the resilience created may also depend on the collaboration across two sectors. So an emphasis on strengthening the mechanisms that facilitate cross-sectoral consultations and consideration will facilitate resilience. We have to recognize the value of science and research. Resilience will be achieved on the basis of targeted and evidence-based responses. So having an already established and strong research community will facilitate quick responses to problems that arise and even enable the answering of local or context-specific issues. So providing incentives for interdisciplinary research, commissioning research to fill gaps, and the deliberate use of research in development is a resilience building strategy. We have to foster innovation and entrepreneurship. You know what climate change is also doing as it presents challenges? It's presenting opportunities. The hotter we get, we need new cooling systems. And there's a great opportunity for bright, creative minds to link that with renewable energy. By having a vibrant and enabling environment for the development and quick deployment of new and creative solutions, that is, if we already foster an enabling environment for entrepreneurship, then in fact we are doing resilience building. There's a role for the private sector to play a part there. We have to really bring into target regionalism. There's clearly a merit in a regional approach to dealing with issues where individual nations each have limited resources. There's merit in regional groupings and alliances taking on common threats so that they not only leverage limited resources but standardize modalities of operations and facilitate sharing of best practices. And then last, of course, we have to develop a communication strategy. Having in place efficient modalities for communication which can be exploited when needed to convey risks, uncertainties, threats, and opportunities resulting from climate change will result in a resilience building effort. So I'm ending where I began. Why exactly does climate demand change? My reading as a physicist is that climate demands change because in the absence of change, things don't add up. That climate demands change because sensitivity plus vulnerability plus inertia does not equal sustainability. And so in our present context characterized by sensitivity and vulnerability, we therefore need a new thing, and I'm suggesting Taylor's equation of state version 2.0, that sensitivity plus vulnerability plus resiliency is going to give us sustainability. And you know what? In transforming our inertia to our resiliency, we'll be responding to the demands of climate. So we'll be responding to the fact that climate is asking us for attention because we are so sensitive, and consideration because we are so vulnerable, and action in response to it. Or, as I've just argued, climate is really demanding incorporation. And when you're doing incorporation, you have done the other three. You have given it the attention, you have given it the consideration, and incorporation is in and of itself an action. So this is my closing charge. If we take up the challenge of resilience building, then we have the real possibility of being ahead of the game through the foreknowledge it engenders as a result of active consideration of both the threat and the needed response to ensure resilience. Otherwise put, there's an opportunity for climate to be a contributor to the development process as opposing to derailing it. Climate demands change. Let us take up the challenge, seize the opportunity for ensuring a sustainable future. Thank you.
I want you to clap again. I feel extremely proud just sitting there and knowing this young man from he was very small. And I think that we have been given a feast. I don't know how many of us have really thought through the whole issue of climate change. As he says, it's something we recognize, it's a phrase we recognize. But I think this evening we have seen the potential impact. And I think his charge to us is one which we need to take very, very seriously. We're going to open the floor now for questions from the audience. And I'm going to ask Professor Taylor that we take about 3 or 4 questions and then ask you to respond, and we'll see how it goes and how much time we have left. So those persons who wish to ask questions, there are microphones. There's one over there and there's one on this side. Would you go to the microphone? Would you state your name, and if you're associated with an organization, would you give us that information as well? And please ask just one question so that we can get as many questions from as many people as possible. Please just ask one question. Right? Right, on that side?
Yes. This is a question that is for Professor Taylor and everybody in this room. And it is, why is it that our planners, government in particular, and some corporations who are involved in the production of energy, are continuing to plan for new fossil fuel powered plants for generating electricity in light of the urgent need to mitigate climate change? And I'm saying this against the background of a lecturer at Stanford University in California who has a book called Clean Disruption, where he talks about two things that impact climate change, and they apply to us. One thing he says is that by the year 2030, all cars will be electric. We have no electric cars. Well, we have one electric car in Jamaica, as far as I know. And he also says that by the year 2030, all new power generation will be solar, and points out the risk to people who are investing in fossil fuel generators, that these investments will end up stranded when solar gets cheaper than fossil power. So why are we in Jamaica still looking at coal, gas, whatever you want to call that, burns, when there are better alternatives out there?
All right, thank you. On this side?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Everton Foster, and I'm with Allied Insurance Brokers. I'm here in my own capacity, not necessarily representing, but just an interest in the subject being discussed. The question is for the professor. Trying to paraphrase, but let me make one disclaimer. I'm by no means anybody who is attached to any scientific. I am certainly not in that field at all. Just a concerned citizen. Professor, considering the proposal to develop the Goat Islands, how does this? Is there any relationship between this and the need, so to speak, to mitigate against climate change? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes? Another question on this side.
Anthony Chen.
Yes, Professor Chen. We are so happy to have Professor Anthony Chen, who is
Thank you.
Professor Taylor's mentor, and of course, our very renowned professor.
Thank you. I guess this is not really so much a question to Dr. Taylor, but Dr. Taylor has given such an excellent lecture pointing out the risks that we face and the need for action. Now, I'm just afraid that the lecture may just become printed in a book or carried home. We need to do many things to counteract climate change. Now, if we leave it to the status quo or the present system, we may not get anywhere. I'm taking a cue from what is happening over the world. Citizens, concerned citizens, who are making the change or changing the state of or the attitude towards climate change. We now have students calling for universities to divest from fossil fuel. We have thousands of people marching in London, in New York, demanding action on climate change. So I think that is what we need in Jamaica. We need concerned citizens acting. I don't know if this would be something that could be taken up by the GraceKennedy Foundation to form some sort of think tank that could, from which ideas of how to concerned citizens can get together and act. If not, I see that there are communication people in the audience, and I'm sure they'd be willing to help to consolidate what Professor Taylor has said. So I'm willing to help to participate in any action like that. We need citizens' action now. We can't depend totally on government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Yes?
My name is Micheal Johnson. I attend Holy Childhood High School, and I have one question. If it is the case that the world will become hotter, will agriculture have to scientifically be modified to increase their resilience as it relates to global warming? And do you think that the government in the future will be able to facilitate these researches as it relates to global warming? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, we'll take, there are two persons on their feet, so can we take these two questions and then we'll ask Professor Taylor to respond?
I don't have a question. I have two or three comments. Professor Taylor knows me very well. He's on my board. Basil Fernandez, head of the Water Resources Authority. I'm so glad he put up that last slide on resilience, because one of the critical things that I see was his first box, which had to do with data gathering, monitoring, and the analysis of the information. That is what we are trying to do now. You have an idea that climate change is taking place and you see climate variability, but you need the information, the data, the scientific information to base your actions on before you actually can determine what action to be taken. Secondly, people are seemingly thinking that no action is being taken. That is not so. Dr. Taylor has spoken about inertia, and we in the water sector are taking different actions. One, we have declared moratorium in granting new licenses for allocation of water resources in certain areas where we see impacts. We have to look at the interaction between surface and groundwater. They don't just exist in isolation in separate boxes. They are interrelated, so we have to take that into consideration. We have done models that look at sea level rise and the saline intrusion into the aquifer. We have to understand the hydrology and the hydrogeology of Jamaica to take action. We have to understand that everybody on the south coast is more vulnerable than anybody on the north coast. And for various reasons, we have the largest urban centers, largest irrigated areas, highest water demand, but the lowest rainfall. We have overcommitted all our water resources pre-1961 when everybody did anything they felt like doing, and we now have a problem that we're trying to solve. But action is there, and we are taking the action to resolve some of those problems and to ensure that we take climate change seriously. But it has to be taken not in isolation, but also in cooperation with other agencies who gather data, and we have to use all that data. And thirdly, I just want to speak to the whole question of the sharing of information. We have a tendency in Jamaica to hold on to information, believing that information gives you power. It does not. It's a waste of time, it's a waste of effort, it's a waste of money to hold on to information. You are collecting information in government services using taxpayers' money. It must be made available online, and it must be shared for you to get benefit. I can't do anything without rainfall data, and neither can the NWC do anything unless they come to me. So we have got to share information and share data. And unless we take those actions, we are going to be in a problem in 2030, 2050, as Dr. Taylor's models have shown. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah. Professor, nice to see you again. All right, my question now, Professor, I'm L.A. Lewis. Everybody in here know me already? Yeah, president of L.A. Lewis Enterprise and Success Record Company and Chilean Records. You understand? What I'm saying now, in every business, marketing plays a key role. Because if the nation does not know about it, it stands for nothing. Because I was invited here by mistake, or I was just coming here to do an event, and someone saw me at the gate and said, LA, they're doing some green project in here. So I'm a person I'm an environmentalist. You understand? So, as the gentleman over there was saying now, I want to know now, how can we use the music business now? Because in the music industry now, we are the one who's driving a big fancy car, them burning the most gas, we're smoking the most weed, cigarette, just our image. Sometimes we smoke cigar just for nothing. Why are you smoking a cigar? For the image, and that is destroying the environment, right? We drive the most cars, and we always feel, and we put on the big muffler, then for hear the big sound, which is destroying the environment, right? So I would say we are the persons, or we are the ones now who should link together and band the bridge. You understand? To put a filter in this big hole for the fundamental level. You all comprehend what I'm saying?
Yes. Very
So-
good. Very important.
So, Professor, as you know me already from a long time, but all right, I watched the show named 2012 or something like that, and I was a little bit scared. But when I heard the professor talking, I'm left in the room like trembling, as you can hear to my voice, because I'm saying, yo, I'm sure I'm dead for a couple of years. I'll come back. So it's unescapable. You understand? So I don't want to, we are to leave here now, and then after we leave here, everybody just go back to them normal business. Because you know Jamaica, that's how we stay already. You understand? So, Professor, I'm putting it out to you now to bridge a gap now with the music industry, you understand, and the science industry to sensitize the nation, because as you know, Jamaica is the small country with a big voice, and when we put out a song now, iTunes, CD, baby, Instagram, everything, the whole world look on Jamaican through those. Yeah. So we want to link together.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Professor Taylor to respond. Could you just wait for me, please? You'll be next. We'll take your question after the response.
Wow. All right, thank you very much. So a number of questions have been raised. Let me probably try to take them in the order. I take the first two together. Really, the first question was not my question, if you heard it.
Yes.
It said, why is government doing this kind of thing? But I want to link the first question with the second question about Goat Island, which, interestingly, I thought would have been the first. You know, really, those two things are asking us a difficult question, and it's a question of how do we develop and still consider the environment. So both of them are kind of a sustainable development question. Both the question about energy and what must be in the energy mix, and large developments like Goat Island. I think what I was trying to say in this lecture here today is that any kind of planning that we are going to have, whether it be planning in the energy sector or whether it be large development planning, has to take into account some things. Certainly, I'm suggesting that it has to take into account, before we make the final decision, is what I'm saying. We are not in the luxury of going one side and doing development without environment. And we really don't have the luxury right now of just doing environment without development. And so we have to consider a couple things. I was suggesting we have to consider things like the risk that is involved in both kinds of developments, whether it be energy or whether it be Goat Island. I'm really arguing that even a development like Goat Island should put on the table how it is factoring climate change into the development. So if we go ahead with it, one of the things is that it's in one of the driest parts of the country. How is it going to deal with water? So factor in climate change as part of the mix when we are putting it to make a decision. I'm saying we must factor in the whole environment and lay it clearly and transparently on the table. We have to, I argued in my lecture for a bias for the environment. How will that bias look if we go ahead? We want to make sure that that is clearly articulated. And then, of course, I was arguing that when you're making that kind of decision, whichever sustainable development decision, we clearly must think about who is going to be disadvantaged, whether who is not only just people, but is also environment, is also. So I'm saying big decisions like that can't have climate change or, well, I'm talking climate change, can't have climate change as a last consideration. Climate change must be put into the consideration right up at the top, in the mix, mainstreaming into the decision making. And when you lay out all of those things with climate change and environment in the consideration, it is on that basis then I am suggesting we can make good and decisions in the best interest of all. And I think that is what I was trying to suggest in the lecture. I want to to answer the question about that, well, not, Prof didn't really ask me a question about, but he made a very good point. We need to leave here, I hope, inspired. And I think that's part of what I was trying to say. There is something for all of us to do. So the action has to take place from the individual level right up through regional levels. And if we leave here simply saying, well, I learned something about climate change, then I think my task has not been a good task. We need to make sure that what we hear inspires us, and then when we are inspired, that we put it in action. And every one of us has action that we can do individually where we are located or as part of the various groupings that we are in society. So I agree with Professor Chen about action as a key thing. To answer the question about agriculture, as I suggested, is going to be one of those vulnerable sectors. With water, I think agriculture is going to be the other issue. And so it tackles things like food security. Will we need to do scientifically modified foods? I'm not suggesting that. There are a whole raft of other adaptation options that can be considered. So in fact, we are already beginning to adapt in agriculture to variations in temperatures. If you go around the country, you see greenhouses. Greenhouses are an adaptation in a sense because it allows you to control the climate conditions. So we need to look on things like that. But we may need to look on things like drought-resistant crops because water is going to be a critical feature of climate change. And I agree totally, we need to have a bias for research, and I think I was trying to make that point very clearly. So, but not just research because of climate change. I am arguing just have a bias to research, and then the research will be there to answer the questions as they crop up. And the research will be there to certainly to help in the resilience building. I think the next question,
Mr. Fernandez.
Mr. Fernandez. Mr. Fernandez, thank you very much for coming. I agree with you totally. And in fact, Mr. Fernandez, I think, was pointing out exactly what I was trying to say in my lecture. Very often we think that climate change demands some special big action outside. And so remember what I said, one of the enemies or one of the things of inertia was that, boy, we're not so certain and we don't have the money. We need a big action to tackle climate change. But Mr. Fernandez was pointing out that in the Water Resources Agency, with the available resources they are putting in place things, and those things that they are putting in place are resilience building efforts. He might not be putting them in place specifically to address climate change, but in doing so, he is addressing climate change. And I was arguing this may be the approach we have to take in a society where resources are scarce. So I agree completely with Mr. Fernandez and applaud him. In fact, I know of much of the work that they are doing. Applaud him for doing what he's doing to build resilience. So he does not let scarce resources be the excuse for building resilience. That is climate change action at work. Then, Mr. Lewis, I'm very glad that you chose to come, that when you heard. And you ask about collaborating with the music industry. I think you are hitting the nail right on the head, really. Music is part of the education strategy. And remember, I suggested, again, you use what is available. So we have a vibrant music industry, and it reaches a whole lot of the young people. And so you are exactly who I want to leave from here and go out and say, how through my music can I spread the message of climate change? Now, I know that there has at least been one video done by the Panos Caribbean, Climate Change, Voices for Climate Change. And you can, look it up. Because there are efforts by a few people, but what a difference it would make when L.A. Lewis Incorporated takes up the mandate and spreads the message. But you also touched on something else. I'm not sure if you realize what you're saying. So yes, using your music as the vehicle. But you're also talking about the fact that in the music industry, you are the people that a whole lot of people look up to. And so the kind of example that you set with respect to how you deal with climate change, how you manage waste, what you deal in terms of your energy sources, how you treat consumption, because you know consumption is directly related in the end. You have, as much as the music is powerful, your example is also equally powerful. And so if you, let me use the term, log on, log on, and through your example and your colleagues, you can also reach many people. And then collaboration was the third thing that you spoke about, which is exactly where I'm going. We have to collaborate. Climate change is not an issue for environmentalists and only environmentalists. I hope I have successfully argued climate change is for all of us because of the pervasive nature of climate change. You know you are climate sensitive because, you know, I was going to say it, but I cut it out. It's strange. You probably don't even realize that you're climate sensitive, but you're climate sensitive because, boy, you can tell mango season different from sorrel time. So it means climate is a part of you and you can distinguish that. You're climate sensitive because we all can jump in our car and reach the beach before midday, which means that we recognize that we have this very limited infrastructure which climate can impact. And we all are climate sensitive because we take for granted that the road network has to be this patchwork of gray. And you know why it's a patchwork of gray? Because it's the newly filled potholes from last rain season with the old filled potholes from or the newly ones from this rainy season with the ones from. And we just take these things for granted, but it's because climate is so much a part of us. You know, and so I'm arguing that we all need to collaborate on this effort. I hope I've answered the questions.
Yes, and I'm just going to take two more. There's a gentleman who was waiting from the previous set of questions, and then there's another gentleman there.
Good evening. I am a student, a proud student of Professor Taylor, and I've a suggestion and to consider the initiation as suggested by Professor Chen. So in our lecture classes with Sir, we spoke about some factors that affect like the intensity of the rainfall and the pouring down during storm or hurricanes. So climate change is one of the factors, and looking from the research and data gathering is as if we'd be sifting out or lessening the impact of climate change on rainfall and the hurricane. So in talking about all our actions and educating the public, that is just seeing that we are taking one factor less, its impact is being lessened, but there are other factors. So this is where resiliency really is necessary. So I am taking up the offer from Professor Chen. I am saying this loud and I'm really all for it. This is where I study. This is the area for it. That if there's any group of young people that can hear right now, put together or do something, form a group on Facebook. I'm willing to start the group and have some meeting or something, because the impact will be great. If we look at the extent to which human beings are living now in Jamaica, it is raising, so you won't leave us to suffer it if you destroy it. And we'll be coming to seeing it as well. So, and our children will be coming to seeing it as well. So if we should really be not selfish and think about others, even if it doesn't affect us directly, still try to help somebody. So I hope Professor Taylor and Professor Chen can join our group on Facebook. I'll tell you the name because I can find you, sir, and we'll start something.
Thank you. Mr. Jain?
Professor, my name is Sushil Jain. I don't know much about this subject, so your lecture was very enlightening, but at the same time very frightening. And I felt that sometimes ignorance is a bliss, and today was one such day. Now my question is, despite all that is happening, is it not possible that some bright minds like you, and maybe me also, can somehow reverse the climate change? Are there not enough global efforts already being made to either reverse it or at least reduce it to some extent?
another cloud to build. Miraculous. There's a third question, although we're not taking. Oh, sorry. Did you want to ask one? All right.
Yes,
we'll take the other question. It's the last
Okay.
one from the floor, because there is one from someone who has been watching on the internet.
Okay. Mine is not really a question, it's just a congratulations to see that you put in values and attitudes into something that we can all do. Sometimes it is a matter that people just do not have the right attitudes or value. I hear people who can afford large cars saying that they have the money, they can afford the gasoline, and it doesn't really matter because they can afford it. They're paying for it, and no one has any right to tell them what they can drive and how much gasoline they use. Now, this is where we need to make changes in attitude and let people see that our individual things that we do have a big effect on the environment. And we are also being influenced by other countries and places where things are happening and changes are being made. I was horrified last month to see that the CEO of Nestlé, one of the largest companies in the world that we sponsor greatly through Nestlé, Maggi, and all of those companies, had said that water should be treated like a commodity. It's a commodity, he said, just like food, and people should have to pay for their water and buy it from companies. So we have to be aware of the attitudes and values and how this is influencing what we ourselves can do to make a change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Salter. One of our member of our audience on the internet has asked, the government agencies and other organizations should be aware of these variables about the climate. Are they? How can we make them aware of these risks? I think it's the question that has been asked before. All right, that's the last question, but I'm just going to ask Professor Taylor to respond.
Thank you very much. Well, I don't know if there are very many, but I'm grateful to see my student take the time out to come. And I'm glad that he has done so. And what is heartening is to see that he's inspired to start something. And I encourage you that when he puts out the Facebook page, please, I think we should all make sure that we like that page or join on the Facebook page. And I think, again, going back, the hope is that having come here, we are inspired, everybody from individual right up to do something. I agree with the second comment that sometimes when you think about climate change, it is very frightening. And boy, I wish I could sugarcoat it and tell you in another way that, when you look to the future. But notice what I was trying to argue, that in the face of inaction, all right, it becomes worse. But I'm suggesting that there are things that can be done. And there are certainly things that we need to do. And I think I've tried to lay out a whole roadmap, all right, to deal with the impacts of climate change. Can we reduce climate change? Right now we don't have the capacity, but I'm not disputing that bright and brilliant minds may come up with something in the future. We have committed ourselves to a certain level of climate change right now. So even if we're able to stop emitting altogether, we still have enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that we're going to have to deal with climate change. And so we need those bright minds now to come up with the strategies and ways and things to deal with adaptation and mitigation. And so I'm again arguing we must create the environment that when they do come up with the solutions, we are ready and waiting to capitalize on them. And if we create that kind of environment, we're building resilience. So resilience doesn't mean you have to go and build a wall to protect you from the sea. Resilience is just creating the environment for the bright minds to deal with solutions to climate change. Thank you. I don't think there's anything really to say that. Just to say that, yes, values and attitudes, I think I have tried to lay out, are critical and key. And promoting values and attitudes are a resilience building effort for the reasons I had given. And the government agencies, I don't want to give the impression that our government is not doing anything. In fact, I was suggesting that there is clear recognition that climate change is a problem. And in fact, we have good agencies right here in Jamaica that are tackling it through a number of projects. So I can think of the Adaptation and Disaster Risk Reduction project that looked on reforestation and it looked on climate education. And there are a number of those kinds of good projects being run by good agencies. I am merely suggesting that perhaps sometimes, however, we say that agency must deal with climate change and it's not the domain of those agencies. And I'm suggesting that, you know, it really needs to be across sectors. But we do have some very good things going on. And Prof. Chen has asked for concerned citizens to make their voices heard. So here's a challenge, I think, to the GraceKennedy Foundation. You have a 5K, if I'm not mistaken. I wonder if maybe the 5K in 2015 could focus on climate change. So there's a lot of people who follow these 5K, so there's an opportunity for education. The shirts of the runners to have the message of climate change, and the banners, etc., to have the message. And we deal with the plastic bottles for water and come up with making sure that those bottles end up in recycling. There's a whole lot that even just taking that activity could make us a big impact in the message. So maybe just a challenge there.
Thank you very much, Professor Taylor. Please let us give him a hand. He can breathe a sigh of relief right now. Before I hand over to Mrs. Caroline Mahfood, who is going to make some presentations, I just want to say, I know this is going to be done later in the vote of thanks, but Mrs. Mahfood is wonderful. She has done so much in terms of organizing and staging the lecture that I just want to say publicly. She and her team deserve all appreciation. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me extend my own congratulations to Professor Taylor on an outstanding presentation. This year's lecture helps to highlight our own foundation's long-standing commitment to the environmental issues. We are aware that much more can be done, and our hope is that the lecture will be a springboard for further change across the Caribbean region. And we actually have a recycling program already implemented in the company, and we want to expand it as much as possible over the next couple of years. In fact, at Champs, we'll be pushing recycling this year. So, by now, those of you in the audience would have received your hard copy of the lecture book. For persons watching the live stream, please note that the e-book will be available online at GraceKennedy.com, and that the lecture presentation can be viewed on our YouTube page, and that copies of the lecture book will be distributed to libraries across the island. I'd like to invite Mr. Don Webby to come forward, the Group CEO of GraceKennedy, to make the following presentations. I'd like to invite Ms. Karen Barton, who is the Director General of the Jamaica Library Service, and Mr. Nicholas Graham, the Director of User Services for the National Library of Jamaica, to come forward to receive copies of the lecture book on behalf of their organizations. And I hope they're here. Okay, Mr. Webby, don't worry. No, I have more for you. We'll keep going. We'll send the books to them. But we'd also like to use this opportunity to publicly demonstrate our appreciation. Oh, thank you, sir. Come forward. Mr. Webby. So this is Mr. Nicholas Graham, who is the Director of User Services at the National Library of Jamaica. Okay, we'd also, as I said, like to take the time now to publicly demonstrate our appreciation to some persons that have helped to make this lecture exceptional. Professor Taylor has major responsibilities not only at the university campus, but also at home. As a husband and a father of 3 young children who have behaved impeccably today. I'm blown away. So, as he mentioned, we kind of put a lot of pressure on him, and preparing the lecture is no small task, and it requires a lot of sacrifice. So we want to use this opportunity to thank Mrs. Taylor for her support over the past few months. And we'd like to invite you to come forward to receive a gift from us. Crystal? Photographer. We could lower it. Maybe we can lower the... Thank you, Mr. Webby. Professor Taylor, it has been an absolute pleasure working with you on this project. We were honored to have you as our 2015 GraceKennedy Lecturer, and we would like to thank you again for your outstanding presentation. And I would like to invite Professor Gordon Shirley, Chairman of the Board of GraceKennedy Limited, to come forward to make a presentation to Professor Micheal Taylor. In 1992, we had another Taylor, as you heard earlier, present a GraceKennedy lecture. And it was entitled Free for All, A Question of Morality and Community. From all accounts, I wasn't born, so. From all accounts, I hear it was a fiery presentation full of conviction and passion. So, have a little clip.
This is far from being a responsible society. And my suggestion to this group this afternoon is that what we need is a responsible society.
All right. Reverend Dr. Burchell Taylor, 2 years ago, we asked Dr. Anna Perkins to continue the theme of morality. And unfortunately, you were unable to attend that presentation. So it's been 23 years since your lecture, but I think it's absolutely fitting that we recognize you and honor you at this, your son's lecture, when I know you must be so proud of him. So I'd like you to come forward, and I'd like to invite several persons. Professor Gordon Shirley will make the presentation, but Mr. Don Webby and Professor Lirani and Micheal to come forward and make this presentation. Come on in. Just a minute for the photograph. Thanks again to all the persons. Thanks again to all the persons that made this a great success, and I hope to see you all here next year. Thank you.
Mr. Philip Alexander, please, the vote of thanks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations, is quoted as saying, "Saving our planet, lifting people out of poverty, advancing economic growth, these are one and the same fight. We must connect the dots between climate change, water scarcity, energy shortages, global health, and food security. Solutions to one problem must be solutions to all." I think we heard that already today in the lecture. Over the past few months, President Obama has repeatedly emphasized the dangers associated with global warming. In his State of the Union address in January, he said that no challenge poses a greater threat to future generations than climate change. In a recent security document, the President called climate change an urgent and growing threat. This evening's lecture has opened our eyes to this fact, and I think very clearly. Climate change demands our urgent attention at the highest level. It's clear that we can no longer make short-term political expedient decisions, but rather it requires governments, private sector alike to work together to face this giant head-on and make some tough decisions now, resiliency, so that the generations to follow may enjoy the Earth's beauty and bounty. The GraceKennedy Foundation has a number of people to thank for their invaluable assistance in staging yet another successful lecture. We are indebted to Professor Taylor for his presentation and writing his excellent lecture book. Thank you for your outstanding scholarship and professionalism during this entire process. We have no doubt that the lecture will become an important resource for students at both the high school and university levels, as well as for the wider public. And I think the feeling is that the wider public has to get involved. Professor, thank you very much. And to the professor's family, thank you also very much for lending him and giving him the time to produce this excellent lecture. As you all know, the intention of our lecture series is to stimulate national debate. And this is facilitated by the distribution of printed copies to schools and libraries across the island. We have to thank the team that has worked exceedingly hard in production of this book. First, we'd like to thank our chair, Professor Elsa Leorani, for preparing the forward to the book and for her continued support of the series. She is doing an excellent job as not only this chair, but the chair of the foundation as well. To Mrs. Charmaine Mackenzie, our editor, who worked tirelessly to ensure that the book was produced in time for the lecture. Mr. Dale Beckford, our graphic artist, who designed our very attractive book cover. And to Mr. Richard Schofield of Phoenix Printers for ensuring that we produced a quality publication. Putting on a function like this requires a lot of hard work, creativity, and meticulous planning. We thank the organizations and individuals who have made this evening possible. Ms. Annette McDonough, our public relations consultant. Mrs. Carol Gray of Hip Top Tents for the wonderful ambience she has created. Scan Media for photography services, Mr. Errol Russell for recording the function, and of course, the Pegasus Hotel for the venue and the delicious refreshments that we'll enjoy immediately as soon as I get finished with this. This year, we extended our coverage globally in keeping with our theme of being a global company, streaming the lecture live through our YouTube page. Thank you to those who have logged on to watch the lecture. This would not have been possible without the support of Mr. Mark Wyatt and the team from Visual Tech Solutions Limited, who also provided the audiovisual support for today's lecture. Please note that an edited version of the lecture will be posted to the GraceKennedy Foundation's YouTube page and the ebook to the GraceKennedy website. So it's accessible to anyone at any time. A very special thanks to the GraceKennedy staff and our foundation scholars who served as ushers today. And a special thanks to Mrs. Dion Roden and the company's corporate communications team, Simone, you and your team, who aided with the coordinating the media coverage for this event. To our immediate family, members of the GraceKennedy Foundation Board, thank you for providing your vision and support. And a special thanks to members of the Foundation Secretariat. Mrs. Caroline Mafood, who continues to do an excellent job, and her team, who have worked tirelessly to make this evening the success that it has been. Last, but of course not least, we thank each and every one of you for taking the time to be here with us and for contributing to the amazing energy and vibrancy of this evening's discussion and debate. We continue to be encouraged by your passion and thirst for knowledge and support for Jamaica. May you all have a safe journey home this evening, and thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you all next year. Thank you.
Your program says closing remarks, but my closing remarks are just join us outside for some refreshment and travel safely home. God go with you.